Robert Fishman will explain us. We have the possibility, and we are glad to have today with us to comment and discuss the results of these very important US elections that have replicate like their effects to any place in this planet, and that they were so important in many different levels. We have Professor Robert Fishman with us. He is currently Carlos III University Konex Marie Curie Professor of Political Science and Sociology. And he was a professor of sociology at the Kellogg Institute at the University of Notre Dame in the United States. And prior to that, he was also associate professor of government and of social studies at Harvard University. Professor Robert Fishman's books include Democracy's Voices, published by Cornell University Press in 2004, winner of honorable mention for best book in 2005 of the American Sociological Association section on political sociology. Another book is Working Class Organization and the Return to Democracy in Spain in 1990, and with Antoni Messina, The Year of the Euro, published by the University of Notre Dame in 2006. I think he is one of the most interesting voices to understand and to assess what the United States is going through in these days and in these last years, in this era of Trumpism. He has been participating in different TV shows and radio programs in the last hour, so probably he's very tired, and we really want to appreciate the possibility of discussing with him in the next 55 minutes. We will raise some questions along with Professor Jauma and also Antoni Castells and Mercè Kirchner, and after 20 or 25 minutes, we will open the floor to for the students to raise their questions. You can all raise your questions through the chat. I think this way will be much easier. And remember to switch off your microphones and cameras again. Professor Robert Fishman, welcome and thank you. Of course, the first question that we have to raise in this particular moment is, where are we now and what can happen in the next hours, days, or weeks?
Thank you so very much, Oscar. Thank you so very much, Professor Mateos, for the invitation. Thanks to your colleagues as well, and greetings to all of you, your colleagues, your students in Barcelona, and bon dia a tothom. We are in a moment of great uncertainty, and a moment that is going to make us all feel quite nervous. In some respects, this is a moment of normality for American politics, such as it is, but in other ways, it's a moment of tremendous abnormality, and it's a moment that's much more serious than a normal post-election moment. I want to make 2 points here, or 2 big points. The first one is, for those who don't have a lot of familiarity with American politics, is that close elections are common in the United States, and the process of counting the votes can take a long time. It's very normal not to know the results of an election until the day afterwards, or sometimes even weeks afterwards. The way that votes are counted in the US is decentralized to states, and within states to counties. There's no comparison to Spain and the way vote counting works in Spain. So that's, in a sense, normal. What's not normal are 2 points here, or in fact, 3 that I want to mention quickly. And sorry to go on so long, but I think these are basic points to make by way of background. One thing that's new and different is that the President of the United States now is a man who does not follow conventional rules about how to behave in a democratic system. He menaces his political opponents, and he has indicated that he may well not accept the results of the election if he doesn't win. And he basically tried to claim victory late last night before the votes had been counted. So this is really unacceptable, and it's potentially quite dangerous. We're also in an exceptional moment because of the deep polarization of American society. So that is new. And then there are two other things I want to mention quickly. One is probably obvious to everyone, but the other probably not so obvious. The obvious thing is that the coronavirus pandemic makes all kinds of things more complicated, including voting and vote counting. And due to the pandemic, a huge proportion of the total vote was cast by mail. 2/3 of the vote, at least, was cast before the polls opened. And those votes are being counted in a different way, at a different velocity than the votes cast yesterday on election day. And that leads to great uncertainty, to differences from one state to another in how the mail-in votes are being counted. And President Trump is trying to make use of that fact to delay or even stop the vote counting in some places when it is traditional in all democracies. It's required in all democracies that all votes be counted. So that's one point. And then the final thing that I want to say very quickly is that in the popular vote, it's clear that Biden has won. He's ahead now by about 2% in the popular vote, but by the time the vote counting has ended, considering the fact that many votes remain to be counted in Democratic strongholds, it is virtually certain that Biden's margin in the popular vote will grow considerably. I would estimate that it will probably be 3.5%, maybe even 4% when all the votes have been counted. Probably, in fact, about 4%, 3 to 4%. And if Trump remains president because of the Electoral College, even though Biden will have more votes, this will really tend to undermine the democratic legitimacy of the system. This would then be the 7th of 8 recent elections in the US that Democrats win in the popular vote, but the Democrats have lost 2 of those elections in the electoral vote. And if this happens a third time, it will raise increasing questions about the legitimacy from a democratic standpoint of the American constitutional system. So we're in a moment of uncertainty, not only about this election, but about the political future of the United States. That's my long answer to your question, Oscar.
Thanks very much. I think Professor Jaume Suau.
Yeah, thank you very much for your first answer, Professor Robert. It was very interesting. I think, in my opinion, we are now in one of the, many people said that perhaps the worst case scenario here, it was to be precisely what happened, which is that after counting the votes in the polls, the winner was not clear. And then we're going to depend on counting this kind of, vote by mail. And of course, we all knew that, Donald Trump was going to use that in his favor. And he actually did that a couple of hours ago in the speech that he has done, that actually each sentence that he said was a lie or a half true. But my question is what do you think is going to happen now? What's going to be, is this going to end up in the Supreme Court? Is the Democratic Party going to push, to try to resist this kind of narrative of Donald Trump? What's going to happen now, according to you?
Well, thank you so very much for the excellent question. And clearly, we're in a situation of uncertainty. The Democratic Party will clearly respond vigorously and clearly to any and all efforts to stop the vote counting, and also to any and all efforts to delegitimize the process of vote counting. To the extent that Trump tries to do so, and he's already started that, he may lose some support from institutionally minded Republicans. He's already lost several lawsuits because Republican judges did not agree with his concerns. So it's clear that there's an important segment of the Republican Party which is in favor of maintaining the institutional integrity and normality of the vote counting process. At some point, they may support efforts to stop things, but not over the next few days. So I think that if Trump tries to get the courts to stop vote counting over the next few days, that will not be successful. I would be very, very shocked if it were successful. But what he may be able to do, and here I think no one knows the answer, what he may be able to do is to encourage his most extreme supporters to take to the streets. So many people are afraid of the danger of unrest and even violence in the streets. I am not able to quantify that risk. I don't know how I possibly could, but it is a point of some concern to many people. Last night, Biden indicated very clearly that neither he nor Trump can declare who has won the election. Only voters can decide who has won the election. And clearly the Democrats will be making that point repeatedly.
That's a very interesting response, Robert. Just a kind of follow-up of the response. I was very interested with what you said about institutionally minded Republicans, right? Because I think that's a very interesting point, because we have seen the last years how the Republican Party has been changing from the inside. You know, in Europe we have this far right from the outside that change politics because a new party enters into the parliament and it changes national politics. But in the USA, it's kind of different, also because electoral system and so on. According to your opinion, what's the evolution of the Republican Party in the last year? What kind of percentage of these kind of moderate Republicans there still exist there that can hold, you know, towards this kind of authoritarian populism that Trump represents?
In the Senate and in the House of Representatives, the moderate Republicans have almost disappeared, and the strong support for Trump has increased among Republicans in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. In the judiciary, that's not true to the same extent, and there are a number of important judges who are trying to act with significant independence from Trump because they know that they, as Republican judges, have a majority within the judiciary. And I think they correctly understand that if they rule in favor of all the wishes of Trump, they will undermine the legitimacy of the judiciary and of the entire system. And they don't want to do that. So there are some institutionally minded Republicans, and I would say at this moment, especially within the judiciary. There may also prove to be some in the Senate, but I think we have to wait and see. We really need to be patient for the moment. The American system requires people to live in uncertainty for significant periods of time. And of course, in some ways, that's true in other countries too. In Spain, after an election, although people quickly know the results of the election, it takes a while to figure out which candidate is going to be able to assemble the majority support needed for an investiture vote as president of government, or as we would say in English, prime minister.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Fishman. One of the things that probably we all have, or we all had during the last evening, is the impression that we were in a sort of deja vu 4 years ago, what happened with Hillary. And this is especially due to the fact that polls and surveys have failed dramatically again, because it was quite clear just 1 day ago that Biden was really ahead of Trump in many states. I'd like to know, first of all, why do you think again this has failed? And secondly, by looking at and assessing some swing states, which do you think are the most important surprises or shocking results in some of these swing states that were or that are still in fact crucial for the final result?
Okay, very good question. The polling at the national level appears to have been off by a greater margin in this election than in the election 4 years ago. And the only major national election in the last 80 years in the United States in which the polling at the national level has tended to be off as strongly as seems to be the case here on average was the election of 1948, when the then President Harry Truman was elected, even though polls said he would lose. Having said that, at the national level, there were some polls that were predicting a fairly narrow margin for Biden of 3-4%, and that is probably what he will win by in the popular vote. But then we get to the state polling, and in fact, in the state level polling, a number of polls showed state level races to be very, very close. But even though that's the case, on balance, Trump is outperforming the polls. So what is the surprise? What happened? And are there any other major surprises at the state level? Well, several points. The first thing that I would say is that it appears that undecided voters and what I like to call low intensity voters, those who do not have a very strong preference one way or the other, tended at the end to move to Trump. And that may be because they were fairly pleased with the economic situation in the United States, which improved to some extent during the Trump presidency. So that is, and even during the pandemic, Trump managed to secure a stimulus package that sent every voter $1,200 as an individual. So all voters are sitting on $1,200 in their checking account. And that is something that may have helped Trump with low intensity voters. So that could be part of the story. He seems to have picked up a lot of those at the end. A number of polls had Biden around 51%, Trump around 42%, and a lot of undecideds. Well, basically the undecideds seem to have moved for the most part to Trump. So that's one thing that happened. The other thing that I think should be mentioned is that the Hispanic vote, which was overwhelmingly Democratic 4 years ago, is now very hotly contested. And in some places, it seems to have favored Trump. And the one place where that most clearly happened, and the biggest surprise of the evening, is Miami-Dade County, the biggest county in Florida, which Hillary Clinton won massively and Biden won by a very narrow margin due to a big change in the Hispanic vote in Miami-Dade. So that's a surprise. And in that regard, I think that one thing that needs to be mentioned is that Trump's strategy politically 4 years ago was to instill fear in the mass public in the United States about what he argued was the danger posed by Hispanic immigration. And that effort clearly led to a lot of Hispanic support for the Democrats, unsurprisingly. And Trump really did not play that card in this election. He decided instead to play other cards of fear, not a card of fear based on trying to demonize Hispanic immigrants. And as a result, his standing improved with the Hispanic vote. That's the one electorate where he did much better in this election than 4 years ago. With other segments of the electorate, he did worse than 4 years ago.
Thanks very much. We have already two questions. First one by Professor Antoni Castells.
Thank you, Oscar. All right, well, first I thought that while listening to your answer, Professor Fishman, I thought of in an article I read just 3 or 4 days ago, they talked about polling and how one of the conservative think tanks that was actually predicting a victory for Trump claimed that they were using a different method. Instead of phone and personal polling, they were using big data, and they said that that was more reliable. So I don't know if we're seeing here a change of paradigm in the type of predicting elections, instead of what we know as polling and conducting surveys, just analyzing data, obtained either legally or illegally, and that it may be a lot more accurate. I don't know. That's just a thought. I don't know. But my question, that if you have any comments on that, I would appreciate to hear them. But my question was about this surprise, if I may say, of what's happening now, and also about President Trump right away claiming victory so early, and even by tweet, even before he spoke, saying big win. Right? I used to live in Florida in the year 2000, in 2000 election. So my question is, well, first, if you could explain very briefly what happened in 2000, because I think most of our audience was not even born back then. And second, what have we learned? What lessons have we learned or haven't we learned from what happened in the year 2000, seeing what's happening right now? I'm just like Professor Mateos. He says he's having a déjà vu because of the surprise. I am having a déjà vu because of what happened in 2000, right? For different reasons, but we both are having déjà vus in this election. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so very much for the question. Let me say a word first about the polling. The polling outfit that has been most in the news based on its use of very non-standard methodologies, and which was predicting a Trump victory, was Trafalgar. And the Trafalgar poll predicted at the state level Trump victories 4 years ago and again this year. But Trafalgar will not reveal what methods it uses. They claim at Trafalgar that they need to do unusual things to make voters feel comfortable saying what they really believe. But they appear to have overstated Trump's support in this election. So I am not at all convinced that Trafalgar is really better than some of the other pollsters. But it is right that some of the pollsters were wrong. And I think as a general rule that the pollsters that were most wrong this time were those that use only online technologies. Now, there are ways to correct for the limits of online technologies, and the best pollsters who use computer-aided interviewing and online access, the best of them do correct for any possible biases, but it's not easy to do that. And it seems that the most accurate pollsters in this election were those who use automatic telephone interviewing in which it is not a person, but a machine that calls people up and asks them to respond. And the whole objective here is to get low intensity voters to say what they're really going to do. And that may be very, very difficult. And it may be unpredictable until the last minute. So it's possible that Biden didn't do as good of a job as he should have at appealing at the last moment to low intensity voters. I really don't know, but I think there will be a lot of reflection on that. Now, you ask a very, very excellent question about the year 2000. In the year 2000, there was a very close election between Al Gore, then vice president of Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush, who became president and served for 8 years. And in the election of 2000, Gore won the popular vote by about 0.5 percentage point, and the Electoral College was very closely contested. And the decisive state was Florida. In Florida, in the official vote count, Bush won the state by something like 527 votes only. That's very few votes. It's a narrower margin than we're seeing in any of the states right now. So if people say to you, the margins are close now, they were much closer in the year 2000. And there were a number of problems with the vote count that year. One of the most important ones was that in a crucial county of Florida, Palm Beach County, the ballot that was designed by county officials was so hard to interpret that it seems that at least 13,000 voters misinterpreted it. They thought they were voting for Al Gore, but they ended up voting for a minor candidate. And just to give you an idea, there are a lot of retirement communities in that county, Palm Beach County, some of which happen to have a lot of Jewish people in them. And the minor party candidate was one who had often said anti-Semitic things. So you wouldn't expect him as an extreme right candidate who had said anti-Semitic things to get significant votes in the Jewish retirement community, which for those of you who don't know is an extremely pro-democratic group in the United States. The Jewish minority in the United States is very, very heavily Democratic and certainly not inclined to vote for that extreme right candidate. Well, in Palm Beach County, there were a lot of votes in retirement communities for that candidate. And almost everyone thought it was because the so-called butterfly ballot was very confusing and hard to follow, hard to interpret. So it's likely that the Democrats lost 13,000 votes over that. Well, you really can't do anything about it. If a ballot's confusing, it is. Once the vote has been cast, whether you like it or not, it's cast the way it was. But there were many other reasons to think that it was a good idea to have a recount. And in the United States, as in most democracies, when an election is decided by very, very few votes, in Florida, it was 527 votes in a huge state, there's a recount to see if there have been any errors. And there are reasons to believe that there were errors in the vote count. And the Republican Party went to court to stop the recount from taking place, which many people saw as being a scandalous effort to keep democracy from working. In the end, won that battle in the Supreme Court. The recount did not take place, and George Bush became president. Now, if we fast forward to 2000, I think that if a battle like that comes up again, the Republicans would win a battle like that in the Supreme Court. But that's not what Trump is trying now. He's not trying to avoid recounts. He's trying to simply stop the initial count. And that is something that I think it is very unlikely he will be able to win in the Supreme Court. We have to wait and see, but I think that's unlikely. A recount, I think he might be able to stop. An initial count, I think he cannot stop. And there's one other point that differentiates 2000 from 2020. The disparity in the popular vote in favor of the Democrat, Al Gore, who ultimately lost the electoral college vote. That's the indirect way that American presidents are chosen, through the electoral college. The Democrat who won the popular vote but lost in the electoral college had won the popular vote by 0.5%. In this election, Biden will certainly win the popular vote by more than 2%. So the disparity in favor of Biden in the popular vote will be much larger than was the case in 2000. And as a result, if nonetheless the electoral college indirect system gives a victory to Trump for the second time in a row, this will, for many voters, undermine the legitimacy of the system, much more than was the case in 2000.
Thanks very much. Professor Mercé Kitchener is the next one. We have many questions already in the chat that we will be trying to raise.
I will try to be as brief as possible in answering. No promises, but I'll try.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert Fishman, and I will try also to be short in my question. So, what I am, well, you've hinted a little bit in a couple of interventions in relation to this, but what I'm really interested is at knowing really the reasons for, or understanding the reasons for the electorate to vote, be it for Biden or for Trump, but more so to understand really to find ways to understand the rise of this populist figure. You said that all elections are always very close. Of course, it's sort of a big majority, mostly system. So there is really the likeliness for a divide in society and in the electorate. But what we see maybe is that in an increasing the bitterness of these divisions in society in the United States. I don't know if it's something that we just see from abroad, if it's something that really the traditional polarization between the coastal states and the central states, it's becoming bigger. If there is an increase of communities feeling excluded, if there is kind of a breakdown of institutions, traditional institutions in the United States, family, community, civic engagement also that has been very strong. I don't know. I would like maybe to focus a little bit on this, no? On the nature of the electorate, on how this will be mobilized by a populist figure. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for the excellent question. Let me say, first of all, that Trump has perhaps a great deal in common with Berlusconi in Italy. They're both entrepreneurs or business people who are expert communicators. And of course, Berlusconi won a number of elections in Italy before ultimately losing most of the support that he had initially had. And so it's not only an American problem, obviously. Now, Trump's capacity as a communicator is really the capacity to stitch together or unite different electorates. So let me say a few words about the different electorates that Trump has stitched together in this election and previously. One of the electorates, one of the segments of the electorate that Trump has managed to mobilize and gain the support of is the segment of the electorate that is very uncomfortable with the racial, cultural, and linguistic diversity of the United States. And I think that in every country, there are elements of the electorate that are uncomfortable with diversity. That's certainly true in the United States, and it's true elsewhere. But that alone would not be enough for Trump to be able to do as well as he did in this election. So that element of the electorate, which sadly includes some people who are, to put it simply, racists, and others who may not be racists, but who are just not very comfortable with diversity. That segment of the electorate is significant, but it would not have allowed him to get where he is. There's another segment of the electorate that we could describe as being culturally very conservative on matters having to do with issues ultimately decided by the Supreme Court, questions having to do with, for example, same-sex marriage, questions having to do with abortion, and various other questions. And Trump has decided, even though I don't think, to be honest, that he's personally morally conservative, I think he's personally uninterested in morality. That's my impression. Obviously, I don't know what's in his heart or in his mind, but that's my impression. But he's decided that it's in his interest to align himself with moral conservatives, and that has given him another segment of the electorate. And then there's another segment of the electorate that's in favor of tax cuts for wealthy people. And finally, there are some who believe that he is somehow economically very effective. And they believe that because the period of time in which he's governed has been a period of time of good economic performance until the beginning of the pandemic. I don't think it was good performance because of his policies, but he's benefited from economic growth that began during the presidency of Obama. So Trump has stitched together those different electorates. He's done it effectively, and it leaves the system in a situation of real crisis because Trump really questions the legitimacy of his opponents. And he has a very simplistic way of addressing complex issues, whether it's the pandemic, climate change or anything else. He often denies facts. And from that standpoint, he is a really very problematic president in the views of many voters. And that's why he did not do very well with people who have a university education. I don't know if that's a sufficient answer to your question, but that's what occurs to me. Thank you very much for your question.
Thanks very much. We have many questions in the chat. We are gonna take 2 questions each time, because I think it would be, some of them probably are already repeating some ideas that you probably have already tackled, but we will take 2 questions each time. The first in the list are Alba Ferrero and Miquel Sistach. You can raise personally your questions to Professor Fishman. Alba Ferrero and Miquel Sistach.
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
I am going to reformulate the question because I think you mentioned it before. So my question is, do you consider that fraud is taking place in these elections?
Well,
we also, sorry, Professor Fishman, we also take Miquel Sistach question. Maybe he cannot speak, so I read the question that raised by Miquel. He said, how important do you think a Republican majority Senate would be for a Biden presidency? So we have these 2 questions, and then we will move to 2 other questions.
Okay, thank you.
Bruno, can you get ready?
Thank you so very much for both of those questions. First of all, is there fraud taking place? Well, Trump claims there's fraud taking place, and there's no evidence of massive intentional or coordinated fraud. But I can assure you that there is always fraud in American elections of at least 2 types, if not more. Before I explain the 2 types of fraud that always take place in American elections, let me explain that the process of controlling and certifying who can vote is more complicated in the United States than in Spain, because in the United States there is no document of identity. There is no DNI, as in Spanish or Castilian. There is no such document in the United States, and that makes it more difficult to certify that everyone who's voting is the person that they claim. And this is something that Republicans often complain about, but they're opposed to requiring that everyone get an officially government-issued ID, which is what clearly would be necessary to resolve this problem. At the same time, there is another kind of voting fraud that takes place, which is a deliberate effort to suppress the vote, to keep people from voting. And there's a lot of that goes on, particularly it is alleged by Democrats that the Republicans do this in order to reduce turnout by key supporters of the Democratic Party, African Americans and poor people. And indeed, many such people received telephone calls yesterday telling them not to vote because there was a danger of unrest, and telling them that they should wait until today to vote. Well, of course, if they waited till today, Wednesday, to vote, they wouldn't be allowed to vote. And there were many huge numbers of people who received such telephone calls yesterday. That is an effort at illegal voter suppression, and that takes place. So in the United States, there are multiple ways in which the electoral process is less clean than in other countries. My own judgment is that vote suppression is the big problem, but I think it's fair to say that there is some voter fraud, and there's some voter fraud also throwing away votes. And although Trump seems to be claiming that this only happens to Republican votes, there are very, very strong reasons to believe that the Democrats have often been the victims of that kind of fraud. So is there fraud? Yes. Could it be eliminated in the US? Yes. How? By instituting more federal guarantees on the election system. But the Republicans are against that. And that's very serious. So basically, the problem is that right now, the United States is a country that we continue to think of as being democratic, but right now the Republican Party often refuses to support basic measures needed to guarantee the authenticity of the functioning of democracy. And you are right in your question. Voting fraud is unacceptable, and there should be federal guarantees in place to assure that neither voting fraud nor vote suppression can take place. Now, the next question had to do with the Senate, and that's relevant, among other things, for the ability of any president to deal with things like voter fraud. In order to deal with challenges like that, they need a majority in the Senate. As of this moment, it appears likely that the Republicans will maintain their majority in the Senate, but by a slightly reduced margin. But there is a chance that the Democrats will gain a majority in the Senate. We don't know yet. And there will be a runoff, which is to say like a segunda vuelta. There will be a runoff election in at least one Senate seat in the state of Georgia, and perhaps in another Senate seat. There are two at stake in Georgia this year, exceptionally, and possibly also in Louisiana. So we will have some Senate elections to be decided later on, and we have not seen all the votes being counted in a number of Senate elections. So basically, we don't know certainly yet what's going to happen in the Senate. I think the most likely thing is that the Democrats pick up one or two Senate seats. The most likely thing is that the Democrats pick up two Senate seats, and they may pick up more, but we don't know yet. If Biden becomes president, the Democrats need 3 Senate seats to control the chamber.
Thank you very much.
Right now, it is very important for the ability of the Democrats to do anything they want to do.
Victor Pla and Bruno Casasus, you can raise your questions.
So first of all, good morning, Mr. Fishman, and thanks for being here. My question is basically do you think that if the Democrats win these elections, maybe they will reduce the protectionism that President Trump has established to other products that are not from the United States, and indeed reduce the taxes from the duties that they have to pay?
And also Bruno Casasus, please.
Yeah, I would like to reformulate the question a little bit. So, good morning, Mr. Fisherman. What do you think will do the most relevant people of each party, especially in the Republican Party, in the hypothetical case that Trump does not accept the results and riots break out? So, will they back him or will they distance themselves from Trump?
Okay, two very important questions. I see that at this very moment, President Trump is now speaking and is trying to question the legitimacy of the vote count, which is something that is required in a democracy. If he has any semblance of commitment to the democratic definition of the United States, he obviously needs to allow the vote count to continue, and he's very explicitly trying to stop that. Now, will he get support from key Republicans in doing this? I don't honestly know, and I don't think anyone can be certain of that, but I suspect that initially there will be an insistence of a number of key Republicans that the vote counting continues. So I don't expect that initially his efforts will succeed, but I could be wrong. I don't know. I can say that if he manages to stop vote counting when it's still taking place, well, imagine what people would do in any democratic country if that happened. It would lead to huge problems. And then it would lead possibly, as you suggest in the question, to riots in the streets, disorder in the street. And at that point, the key people would be in the military and in the National Guard and in the security forces. And would they do what Trump asks them to do? And I think the answer then depends on what he asks them to do. And I think we're potentially in a very, very tense and in the worst case, a very dangerous moment. Hopefully things won't get that bad, but I think we don't know. It's widely said that Trump is desperate to hold on to power because he believes that he'll be subject to a great number of judicial investigations for alleged illegalities that he has committed, and he doesn't want that to happen. So he thinks he's fighting for his ability to stay out of jail. And of course, he's promising that he wants to put his adversaries in jail. All democracies require mutual tolerance between political adversaries to survive as democracies, and Trump is trying to put an end to mutual tolerance. So we're in a serious moment for American democracy. It's not the first time that's happened, but it is a very serious moment. It's a historic moment. Protectionism is an important issue. On that issue, yes, if Biden becomes president, he will be much less protectionist than Trump has been. I don't know if Trump will continue to be protectionist if he holds on to power. I think it's not a particularly important issue to him. I think that he's just been supporting protectionism as a way to win some support, but I could be wrong. It's possible that he really believes in protectionism. I don't know what he believes in. I don't know him personally, and I don't know what is inside his deeply personal beliefs, but I do think that if Biden becomes president, he will reduce protectionism.
Thanks very much. Probably this will be the last two questions we have time to address. Miriam Comas and Miquel Martinez.
Hi, good morning, Professor. So my question is if you think that it would be possible to change this system in the US of the electoral college deciding the elections and to give back the power to the popular vote, because it seems that we're facing now for the second time in a row a little bit of an unfair and maybe undemocratic voting system. And with it, how big do you think this problem is for this election and for maybe the upcoming ones that we will face?
And Miquel Martinez, last question.
Yes, so good morning, Professor Fishman. My question is, do you think that Donald Trump's election back in 2016 and his increasingly or powerful or notable popularity that could lead to his re-election in this week or, well, in this election is a result of a change in the US mentality that has been in Trump or has chosen Trump as a viable representative? Or is it more of a change brought by Trump himself? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, maybe I should speak first to the second question and then to the first question. Is there a fundamental sea change, a fundamental change in what the United States is like? I don't know that that's the case. All indications are that when Trump gets X number of votes, he does that not only because of people who are strongly in favor of everything he says, but because there are some people who think that it's in their interest to support him, even though they don't feel totally comfortable with some elements of his persona. That seems to be the case. So I don't know that the United States has really changed that much. The United States, after all, is a country in which, up until the 1960s, African Americans were prevented from voting in large parts of the United States. The United States has a deeply internally contradictory history. The United States is a country that has experienced a great deal of internal conflict, cultural conflict, political conflict over basic ideals having to do with equality, decency, and inclusion. At the end of the day, in the United States, the forces of inclusion have tended to win, but not at every last moment. They've only tended to win after long periods of time in which there have been long processes of mobilization and political struggle. It took a long time before African Americans won the full right to vote in all of the United States. So let's not assume that before Trump, the United States was always this great land of blooming flowers and beauty everywhere. It wasn't always so easy. There were elements of hatred, division, and so on in the United States before Trump. The McCarthy era, during the late 1940s and early 1950s, was a period of time in which there was persecution of people in the United States over their political ideas. So that's something that the United States has often experienced. It's not totally new with Trump. Is he changing the country? Well, he does seem to be encouraging the growth of more tolerance for racism and hatred and division. But on the other hand, Obama was elected president twice, and most polling indicates that more people like Obama than Trump. So I wouldn't assume that the United States has necessarily changed fundamentally. What I do think Trump is unusually capable at doing is uniting or tying together different kinds of the electorate. This is a man who has great capacity as a communicator. Whatever else you think about him, he knows how to communicate very effectively. And he's done so in a way that ties together different kinds of electorates. So I would not assume that everyone who votes for him shares the worst elements of his political appeal. Now, I personally think that people who don't share the worst elements of his political appeal are best advised not to even think of voting for him. But that's not up to me to decide. It's up to them to decide. That's how a democracy works. Now, on the other question having to do with the Electoral College, very good question. It is a problem. It's a problem that the Electoral College, which is an institution that was designed in the origins of the United States as a constitutional system over 200 years ago. And that system is, I think, now out of date, and it frequently yields anti-democratic outcomes, increasingly anti-democratic outcomes. And if Trump does remain as president, this will be the third election out of the last 5 in which the winner of the popular vote is not able to go on to become president. So that starts to look problematic. But unfortunately, many Americans don't think it's problematic. And the way the American system works, in order to change the Electoral College, you would basically need to amend the Constitution. And amending the Constitution in the United States requires a supermajority in both houses of Congress and also in state legislatures. So it looks extremely unlikely that the Electoral College can be changed. There are some indirect ways that it could perhaps be changed. Each state, according to the current system, is able to decide how to assign its electors. So some people say that if a majority of the states, or to be more precise, if states with a majority of electoral votes legislate the proposition that they will award their electors to the winner of the national popular vote, if and only if states with a majority of the electors decide to do so, at that point, we have, through an informal mechanism from the states upward, we have a change in the institutional system. And that could happen, but it doesn't seem very likely that it will happen in the near future. There will be a lot of pressure to do this if Trump remains as president and the United States maintains democratic liberties. If those two things happen, then I think there will be a lot of pressure to change the Electoral College. Will it succeed? It would probably require a supermajority, either at the national federal level or within specific states. So it's a complicated question, and it has to do with intricacies of how the institutional system works. It's harder to make the change than many people would like to be the case.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the excellent questions.
Thanks very much. We are reaching the end of this session. as planned. And I'd like to, before we thank you for staying with us during this hour, I'd like to know, Professor, which is your opinion about what will happen? I mean, we are still counting a very important critical states like Wisconsin or Nevada. What do you think will happen? Which will be the final result? And in this sense, which do you think are the most likely scenarios in midst of this uncertainty?
Very good question. Obviously, no one knows. I think the most likely scenario is that Biden will win a majority in the Electoral College based on a narrow majority in a number of the states that are still outstanding. But I could be wrong. And Trump could win a majority based on a fair vote count, a narrow majority in some of the key states. And it's also possible that Trump may be able to stop the vote counting at some point. I'm a little skeptical about that, but he's going to try, and it's possible he may succeed. So there are real uncertainties. But there's another uncertainty that's maybe even bigger, and that is how this directly political uncertainty translates into what goes on in the streets and to coexistence between people who disagree. And there, the uncertainty becomes painful to contemplate. So we're in a time not only of uncertainty, but in a time that will provoke a lot of nervousness, a lot of intranquility. And I cannot tell you exactly what will happen. No one knows.
Thanks very much, Professor Fishman. I think it has been extremely interesting to listen to your own insights about the current situation, but also to understand and to learn a lot from U.S. or about U.S. politics. Thanks very much for your time. I know that has been a long night for you, and that it will probably be also a very long day. So we really appreciate your time, your answers, and your reflections that are going to be very helpful for all of us. Thanks very much.
Thanks to you, and all best wishes to all of you.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye now.
Bye. Thank you very much. We leave it here. Thanks to all of you.
Thanks, Oscar.